Folks, I'm back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So, where we left, we were talking about the Republican Party platform of 1860. After the historic debates, Stephen Douglas found himself vilified by Southern Democrats. He tried unsuccessfully to argue that his middle way would enable America to pass over the momentary issue of slavery in the territories and preserve the Union. But Southern radicals would have none of it. When the Democratic Convention met in Charleston, South Carolina on April 23rd, both Northern and Southern delegates were ready for a showdown. The traditional rule that a two-thirds majority was required for a candidate to win the nomination enabled Southern Democrats to veto the nomination if they voted together as a bloc. The first test came when Southern delegates insisted on a plank favoring a federal slave code for the territory. Stephen Douglas, knowing that he would lose every northern state if he agreed, refused to endorse the plank. When the delegates defeated the plank by a small majority, 50 radical Southern delegates, led by Alabaman William L. Yancey, walked out of the convention. Even with the radicals gone, Douglas could not win a two-thirds majority. Neither could anyone else. After 57 ballots, the convention adjourned to meet in Baltimore in 6 weeks. When the shattered Democratic Party reconvened in June, there was no hope for unity. A raucous floor fight broke out over which delegates from the Charleston Convention would be recognized. When Stephen Douglas's forces finally established dominance in this matter, Southern delegates pushed the slave code plank once again. For a second time, Douglas's forces beat it back and managed to nominate Douglas on a second ballot over John C. Breckinridge, the incumbent vice president. Herschel V. Johnson, a former governor of Georgia who supported both states' rights and unionism, was named to the vice presidential spot. He would later become a Confederate senator. The party platform excluded reference to a slave code in the territories and supported the power of federal authority over the territories. It also affirmed its support for a transcontinental railroad to the Pacific and the acquisition of Cuba. Furious Southern delegates, including many who boycotted the convention, then reconvened at the Maryland Institute Hall to nominate John C. Breckinridge as the candidate of the Southern Democratic Party. To run with him, the convention selected Senator Joseph Lane of Oregon. The party platform supported a federal slave code in the territories, the acquisition of Cuba, and the construction of a railroad to the Pacific Ocean. A lot of similarities in the various Democratic platforms. The third group of political leaders met in Baltimore on May 9th to form the Constitutional Union Party. 21 states were represented by men who had been members of the old Whig Party and felt uncomfortable about the Republican Party's radical leanings. They were also Southern Whigs who feared sectional division over slavery as a threat to property and domestic tranquility. Some of these Whigs were former American Party, the Know Nothing Party, who were dissatisfied with either of the existing political groups. The Constitutional Union Party nominated John Bell of Tennessee, Speaker of the House in 1836, War Secretary under President William Henry Harrison and Tyler, and a longtime U.S. Senator. He was a Southerner who supported slavery but opposed its spread into the Western territories. Bell's running mate, former Massachusetts Senator and one-time president of Harvard University, Edward Everett, believed in the need to compromise on slavery in order to preserve the Union. Unlike the Republicans and Democrats, this new party refused to issue a platform statement other than to recognize, quote, no political principle other than the Constitution, unquote, and preservation of the Union. The campaign that followed was, or saw, pardon me, none of the candidates except Stephen Douglas campaigning. Breckinridge gave only one speech. Bell said nothing, and Lincoln, in keeping with campaign traditions, stayed at home in Springfield, receiving delegations who came to pay their respects. Douglas broke with tradition and campaigned all over the country. Most of his appearances were peppered with questions about what would happen should Lincoln be elected. In answering, he always affirmed the president's duty to enforce the laws. By October, concluding that the election was going to be lost to Lincoln, Douglas urged people to reject secession and work within the system. Although the other three candidates did little or no active campaigning, each party sent hundreds of activists out on the trail. Southern radical William Yancey of Alabama aroused Northern crowds with warnings of secession should Lincoln, be elected. Bell supporters handed out bells and rang them loudly at rallies. None outdid the Republicans, who put together groups known as of young men, thousands of young men who turned out in what were called wide awake torchlight parades in support of Lincoln. Voters were urged to, quote, vote yourself a farm, unquote, by voting for Lincoln and the Homestead Act platform. Remember the Homestead Act, 40 acres and a mule. We'll talk about that during the Lincoln administration. Lincoln's opponents countered by making fun of his limited experience as a statesman and his stump speaker style, which instead reflected a limited intelligence that would be an embarrassment to America should he be elected. Cartoons showed Lincoln dancing with African American women and championing what was called amalgamation or miscegenation, the mixing of the races. The election of 1860 positioned America on the brink of fundamental change. A Republican win would end the South's political dominance of the Union. Southerners had been president for 2/3 of the time since Washington's time. None of the Northern presidents had won re-election. Up to that point, Southerners had also controlled the speakership of the House, the president pro tem of the Senate, and the majority of the Supreme Court. A Lincoln victory needed to add Pennsylvania, plus Indiana or Illinois, Lincoln's home state, to the Republican list of states won by Fremont, who was the first Republican presidential candidate in 1856. When the votes were tallied, Lincoln, not on the ballot in any Southern state, carried all of the North but one state in the popular vote. With respect to popular support, Douglas comes in second, followed by Breckinridge and Bell. The Electoral College results were different. Most Southerners voted for Breckinridge, who carried 11 of the 15 slave states. Bell won more conservative upper South states, Virginia, Kentucky, his home state of Tennessee. Despite his popular support, Douglas carried only Missouri. The final Electoral College count, Lincoln beat Breckinridge 180 to 72. Bell had 39 and Douglas had 12. Extreme positions identified with Lincoln and Breckinridge appealed to the majority of voters. The combined vote for Bell and Douglas was 100,000 more than that for Lincoln. Those two candidates beat Breckinridge in large parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Had the Democrat Party remained united, it would have carried the popular vote, but still lost the electoral vote or the Electoral College due to Lincoln's domination in northern states. The election underscored the importance of the more populated northern states, which will also be highlighted in the Civil War, of course. By the time of his election in November and inauguration in March of 1861, 7 states seceded. Delegates from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederacy. They drafted and passed a constitution that was similar to the U.S. Constitution, except in 4 areas. The Confederate Constitution supported states' sovereignty, guaranteed the perpetual existence of slavery in states and territories, prohibited Congress from enacting a protective tariff and giving government aid to internal improvements, and limited the presidential term to 6 years. Passing over the most radical secessionists, the convention named Jefferson Davis president. Davis was a Mississippi slave owner and U.S. Senator who had been Secretary of War in Franklin Pierce's administration. Alexander Stephens, a moderate Georgia Whig who became a Democrat, was the Confederate vice president. Davis's inaugural address emphasized secession as a peaceful move that rested upon the consent of the governed to alter or abolish forms of government destructive to their freedoms and interests. The Southern position assumed that America was a compact of states. Each state individually agreed to allow national government to act as its agent without relinquishing fundamental sovereignty. Any state at any time could withdraw from the compact. Most Northerners saw the Union as permanent, quote unquote, a more perfect union than the one operating under the Articles of Confederation. Lincoln denied that the states had ever possessed independent sovereignty as colonies and territories. He claimed that the states accepted unconditionally the sovereignty of the national government with the ratification of the Constitution. To Southerners who claimed the right of revolution to justify secession, just like the Founding Fathers, Lincoln answered with legalistic distinction rooted in common sense. The right of revolution is not a legal right, but a moral right that depends upon the suppression of liberties and freedoms for it to be justified. What rights, what freedoms, or liberties were being trampled by his election? The South still enjoyed all the constitutional freedoms they always enjoyed. To exercise revolution with no moral cause to justify it is what Lincoln called simply a wicked exercise of physical power. Most Northerners agreed with Lincoln that secession amounted to an unconstitutional act of treason. Lincoln passed the time between the Montgomery Convention and his inauguration in silence, but he sent private messages to Congress and key military officers. He reiterated his campaign promise that he would take no actions as president to impair or limit slavery in those states where it existed. Lincoln even supported a 13th Amendment then passed by Congress that would guarantee slavery in existing states. Of course, that amendment was never passed. Line at supporting a package of compromises supported by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. These were called the Crittenden Compromise. This proposal included a series of constitutional amendments to guarantee slavery in the states. The compromise sought to prohibit Congress from abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C., and deny Congress the power to prevent or interfere with the interstate slave trade. Crittenden's legislation also empowered Congress to compensate slaveholders who lost runaway slaves, and protected slavery south of the 3630 line in all territories, quote, now held or hereafter acquired, unquote. Lincoln understood that to accept the amendments would overturn the Republican Party platform. He instructed party leaders to make no concessions on slavery's expansion. The compromise was defeated in the Republican-controlled Congress. Lincoln rejected overtures from a peace convention held in Washington, D.C. under the auspices of the former President John Tyler. Hoping to show peaceful intentions, Lincoln prepared his inaugural with an eye to keeping the Upper South from joining the secessionists of the Lower South. His speech was firm but conciliatory. He reaffirmed his promise not to interfere with slavery where it existed, and he assured the Confederacy that he would not assail them for their actions at Montgomery. On the other hand, Lincoln made it clear that he would, quote, hold, occupy, and possess property in places belonging to the government. He reminded the Confederacy that no state could leave the Union, quote, upon its own mere motion, unquote, and pledged to enforce laws, quote, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is the momentous issue of civil war, unquote. The day after Lincoln's inauguration, he received a dispatch from Major Robert Anderson, commander of the federal installation at Fort Sumter. Anderson notified Lincoln that the fort would have to be resupplied or evacuated. Lincoln, the master politician, in a master stroke that allowed him to attempt to supply the fort without engaging Confederate forces, sent unarmed supply ships, giving advance notice of their peaceful intentions to the Confederacy. This completely shifted the decision as to who would fire the first shot from Lincoln to Jefferson Davis. Davis ordered General Pierre G.T. Beauregard to compel Sumter's surrender before the supply ships could arrive. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns fired on Sumter. After a 33-hour attack and exchange of fire, Major Anderson surrendered the fort. This is the flag, or this is representative of the flag that was flying at Sumter at the time. Lincoln appointed several efficient cabinet members responsible for leading and preparing the American economy for war. His first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, was from Pennsylvania. He was a party boss. He was one who was promised a cabinet position at the convention for Pennsylvania's votes. He had thrown his support to Lincoln at the convention. He was extremely corrupt. He was extremely inefficient. In 1862, Lincoln replaced him with Edwin N. Stanton out of Ohio. At the U.S. Treasury, Lincoln named Salmon P. Chase, also of Ohio, a leading abolitionist who criticized Lincoln for his stand on emancipation. Despite their differences, Chase proved to be an apt director of American finances. Among his most innovative and long-lasting programs was the Legal Tender Act of 1862 to issue fiat currency called greenbacks, which were not backed by gold or silver, to help finance the war. The paper money carried no promise to pay with gold in the future. They were valued as legal tender notes, meaning that everyone was required to accept them at face value in settlement of debts. The majority of the Union's war expenses were financed by taxes, loans, or the sale of government bonds. Chase supervised the first income tax, which was 3% on incomes over $800. It was the first income tax in American history. as well as Chase supervised the national banking system, which was established by Congress and signed into law by Lincoln in 1863. The law resurrected the central banking system destroyed by Jackson in the 1830s. It authorized the chartering of national banks, which could issue banknotes as loans to customers for up to 90% of the value of U.S. bonds held by each bank. This created instant demand for government bonds as private and state banks were forced, to become national banks and bought bonds to issue banknotes to borrowers. These banknotes became an important form of American currency, circulating with greenbacks, paper checks drawn on deposits, and gold-backed certificates. Chase also worked closely with American bankers, merchants, and industrialists to find ways to sell bonds to the greater public. Assisted by Philadelphia financier Jay Cooke, Chase used patriotic appeals to sell war bonds in amounts as small as $50. Cooke sold more than $400 million in bonds. This is for the Union. By the end of the war, America had borrowed $2.6 billion. Opposition to Lincoln's programs and policies by the Peace Democrats spread into full-fledged counter-war measures by 1862. Most opponents were old-line Democrats who resented centralizing laws and measures supported by the Republican majority in Congress. They especially opposed the national banking system, newly passed protective tariffs, the draft, martial law, and emancipation. Winning several congressional seats in 1862, Peace Democrats became more vocal. They were then known as Copperheads. The term came from the practice of some Midwestern hard money Democrats who wore copper pennies around their necks in protest of legal tender greenbacks. When war began, Lincoln decreed by executive order that all people who discouraged enlistment in the Army or engaged in disloyal practices would be subject to martial law. This action suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which prevents the government from holding citizens without trial. Overall, 15 to 20,000 were imprisoned, mostly from border states. The most notorious Copperhead, Clement Vallandigham, a former Ohio congressman, was arrested by the military commander of Ohio in May of 1863 for advocating in his campaign for governor a negotiated peace and anti-war demonstrations. A military court convicted him of treason and sentenced him to confinement for the duration of the war. Lincoln banished him behind Confederate lines to keep him from becoming a martyr. By 1864, Vallandigham was back in the North, drafting the peace platform of the Democratic Party. The incident raised serious questions about the violation of Vallandigham's First Amendment rights and the legitimacy of having military courts in areas like Ohio, where civilian courts functioned. After the war, the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional military trials of civilians during wartime in areas where civil courts were open and functioning. Foremost in Lincoln's mind in 1861 was how to keep the Upper South from joining the Confederacy. After Fort Sumter, with the secession of four more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, Lincoln turned his attention to military victory above all else. He wanted battle victories, but did not want to do anything that might decrease Union sympathies in the South. Of course, this produced conflicting interests. Lincoln never recognized the legitimacy of the Confederacy and refused to officially negotiate with any Confederate representatives, yet agreed to treat all captured prisoners as members of a sovereign nation rather than traitors. Until 1863, when African American soldiers began enlisting in Union ranks, Lincoln and Davis supported a prisoner exchange policy that kept few prisoners in long-term prison camps. With African American enlistment in the American Army, the Confederacy announced that they would either execute captured African American soldiers or return them to slavery. Lincoln diminishes the execution threat by the Confederacy by saying that the Union will execute one Confederate prisoner for every African American soldier killed. The Confederacy abandoned the execution policy, but refused to back down on returning African Americans back to slavery. Few prisoners were exchanged after the summer of 1863. With the fall of Vicksburg and New Orleans, Lincoln confronted how to reconstruct the defeated states. Should Confederate leaders and soldiers be punished for treason, deprived of their property, imprisoned, or exiled abroad? What about Confederate soldiers? Should they be given the right to vote? On what terms should Confederate states be allowed back into the Union? What powers would the Union have over the defeated states? What about former slaves? Initially, Lincoln hoped to offer an olive branch to defeated states with a no revenge policy towards the Confederacy. When Lincoln's forgiving tone enraged radical Republicans, he backed off. Regarding slavery, he first talked about colonization as the best solution and funded projects in Central America and Haiti, neither of which got off the ground. Concerned about the 1864 election, Lincoln hoped to appeal to border state Democrats with his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, which he issued in December 1863. Lincoln offered a presidential pardon to all Southern whites, with the exception of government officials and high-ranking military officials who swore allegiance to America and accepted abolition. If the number of white males swearing allegiance to the Union equaled 10% of the voters in 1860, that group could form a new state government. Radical Republicans in Congress countered with their own proposal in the Wade-Davis bill in July of 1864. A majority of a state's white voters would be required to take an oath of loyalty and guarantee African American equality. Then loyal state voters could elect delegates to a constitutional convention as the first step in the readmission process. Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill, meaning he waited until a new Congress was in session. Once that happens, any bills not voted on basically die. He also invited Southerners to rejoin the Union under either plan, knowing that they would select his proposal, which was not nearly as harsh. I'm going to end there today. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but my plan moving forward is on either Friday or Monday, what we will do is we will talk about the Civil War in its entirety. Right now, we're talking about Lincoln and the political situation, but I do want to talk about the military situation, which is fascinating, of course. So I will break down key battles, where we are in the nation, things like that, most likely starting Friday. Tomorrow, we will talk more about Lincoln and slavery and emancipation, and then we'll move on to the Civil War. Thank you for joining. Thanks for your patience with technical difficulties. I greatly appreciate it. I will see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Have a great evening.